Remember, when we talk about the eukaryotes, we're talking about fungi, algae, protozoa, helminths, multicellular organisms. We'll start with the fungi. Fungi basically is a study referred to as mycology. You may already be familiar with a number of the mycoses that are in the environment now. Canada is one of the, not the country Canada, the microorganism. Yeast infection, one category that's studied in mycoses. There are multiple organisms that are discussed there, and we'll talk a little bit more detail about various types of mycoses, tinea infections, such as those that cause types of dermatitis in various individuals are important as well, and we'll get into more detail about those as well. But all of these fall into categories of eukaryotic types of organisms. We'll start with fungi. Molds are multicellular filamentous organisms that include mildew, rust, smut. Those are all various names that you can see used for fungi. There are fleshy fungi that include mushrooms and or puffballs. Has anybody ever seen a puffball before? Okay, I hear you. Yeah, puffballs. See, you're from the rural area. I won't say the country, but from the country. From the country. I'm from the country. And so it's puffballs. You run around, you kick the puffballs. Your grandmother tells you not to do it because there's poison gas that comes out of them. And when you kick them, it looks like that. It's like this little cloud of either, sometimes they're yellowish, and they give this little yellow cloud of smoke that comes out. Beg pardon? Are they kind of small? Yeah, they're kind of small, about the size of a softball. Some of them even smaller, about the size of a baseball. But they grow out of the ground, and you run by and you kick it, and you can keep running around and you can keep kicking it, and this cloud of this little smoke will come out of it all the time. But they call them puffballs, but it's a form of fungi. Many of you are familiar with mushrooms. There are a lot of different kinds of mushrooms, but some of you may be familiar with the mushrooms that you eat with food and stuff, but there are other types of mushrooms out there as well that we'll touch upon. Most of the characteristics of fungi, they have vegetative structures, fungal filaments called hyphae, formed from the body, the molds, the fleshy portion of the fungi. There are cross walls of hyphae and septae. And your book has some illustrations that show you the hyphae and septae and how these structures are shaped to form the structure of fungi. In the vegetative structures, yeast usually reproduce by budding, in which we see a protuberance on the cell that enlarges, eventually separate from the other cells from one another. We see daughter cells that do not detach immediately, and they form a short chain or a pseudohyphae. And then some yeast, like fission yeast, will undergo fission as a part of reproduction. The eukaryotic, they're aerobic, facultative, anaerobic, chemoheterotrophs. Most of them are decomposers. And again, as we said, the mycology is the study of fungi or mycoses. This basically goes through the cell types in comparison of fungi with bacteria. We already separated and identified the differences in the prokaryotes and the eukaryotes. It just gives you an idea. And again, this table is taken out of your book. This gives you the not only some of the physical characteristics, but separates each of the organisms into their various kingdoms, the nutritional requirements of each, whether they're chemoheterotrophs, photoautotrophs, chemoheterotrophs, or chemoheterotrophs, how they absorb food, their characteristic features, reproduction, so forth and so on. This is a picture again out of your book that just demonstrates the structures of particular types of mold. Consist of hyphae, and again the picture identifies the structure referred to as the hyphae. Again, you're not able to really appreciate that on a basic auger, but again, there are structural components of molds. Now, many of the characteristics of fungi are follows. Many yeast are facultative anaerobes. They ferment carbohydrates. That's the key point that you need to remember about yeast. Ferment carbohydrates. They produce CO2 and ethanol. Who's done the lab already this week? Okay, one person did the lab. I had one person call me. I forgot to put the lab up on Tuesday, and I had somebody call. 2 people have done the lab. I saw the hand. Yeah, and she reminded me I didn't put the lab up, and I was like, well, there was only one person that called me and said that I didn't put the lab up. But I know you're going to catch up. I don't have any doubt about that. Anyway, that was your lab this week, was the process of fermentation. Again, we see it characteristic of fungi. They ferment carbohydrates and produce CO2 and ethanol. You know that about fermentation. And again, being able to identify this process of fermentation would be able to help you identify this microorganism. These are some of the structures of yeast. Again, this will be posted up next week for you to be able to review these particular types of cell structures as a part of your lab for next week. Again, yeast, unicellular structure, how it divides by fission. Budding yeast divide asymmetrically, but it gives you a good idea. And this is an electron microscopy. This is the demonstrating just the, again, structural components, the yeast-like growth, the hyphae, the septi that are a part of this organism. In the life cycle of mold, we see asexual spores will arise from organisms only. Sexual spores result from the fusion of nuclei of two opposite mating strains. There are arthrospores and chlamydia spores. Arthrospores are formed from fragmentations of the septae and the hyphae into a single cell, and chlamydia spores form from rounding and enlargement of segments of the hyphae. And you say, why is all of that really important? Do I really have to know that? No, you don't, but it is part of the structure of these organisms, and I would be remiss if I didn't really go over it with you. But I recognize that for the purposes of your course, you want to know these organisms do cause human diseases. The mycoses are the diseases that they cause. But if you're trying to identify these under a microscope, and I would expect you to be able to recognize these components, as I showed you in the picture before, wherever that picture was at, as I showed you in the picture before here. So I would expect you to be able to recognize these structures, but for the purposes of clinical reference, I recognize that all of these components are not important to you as far as clinical application goes. But sporangiospores, conidiospores, and blastospores are basically the spores that you see from these various types of organisms. And this looks at the fungal life cycle. Again, I appreciate you doing that through your reading to be able to identify the fungal life cycle. This is a good picture illustrated here that helps you to identify the structures of the conidia, the conidiospore, basically in the fungal life cycle. Now, fungal diseases and mycosis. And this is the meat of what I want you to appreciate for this topic. Systemic mycosis. These are infections that can exist in the body, and it can exist deep in the body and typically spread to multiple organ systems in the body as well. There are subcutaneous mycosis that will exist beneath the skin. There are cutaneous mycosis that actually will affect the hair and the skin and the nails. A lot of the superficial types of mycoses that we see that cause irritation and itching on the skin are the cutaneous types of mycosis. There's superficial mycosis, which are localized, such as hair shafts, and then opportunistic mycosis. These are organisms that may be a normal part of the flora in our body, but under special circumstances, when we alter the pH, when we change the chemical makeup of the body, that these opportunistic mycosis may grow. An example of that is a yeast infection. A yeast infection, yeast Candida is a normal part of our body. It lives in our body routinely. However, if we take antibiotics for prolonged periods of time, we change the normal flora or the normal microbiota in the body. The normal flora in our body competes with Candida for food sources, and typically the bacteria wins. And because of that, fungus can't grow out of control, or Candida can't grow out of control. But if we take antibiotics, especially antibiotics for prolonged periods of time, we kill off bacteria, and we kill off the normal flora bacteria that typically keeps yeast from growing. And so you may begin to see a black tongue, where actually fungus will start to grow on your tongue. You may get white plaques on your tongue, which is yeast growing because the bacteria has been killed. You may get yeast infections. Vaginal yeast infections are very common, secondary to the use of antibiotic therapy, because the normal bacteria that exist in our body is killed by the antibiotics that we take, and these opportunistic infections related to fungus, mycosis, will begin to grow accordingly. Now, there are obviously some disease conditions that compromise our immune system that can also allow these fungus to grow. Pneumocystis carinii pneumonia is an example of that. Opportunistic infections that will occur based upon something has changed in the normal flora, the normal microbiota, and now the fungi that was normally kept under control would have an opportunity to grow. So you need to be familiar with this page and these definitions. I already showed you this on another slide, the sporangia, the coniospores, and the arthrospores of a particular organism. And this is just a nice picture out of your book. You can, suitable for framing, where you can look at the conidia spores, the arthrospores of the various types of organism. Really looks good under a black light. And those mushrooms I was talking about before, I'm sorry. There are sexual spores, fungal spores, result in 3 phases of sexual production. And again, I'm not going to ask you to recognize the sexual reproduction of the conidia spores. So there's asexual and sexual reproduction. Most fungi will exhibit only asexual spores, but recognize that sexual spores may also exist in these organisms as well. Don't have to know that. Zygospores, you don't have to know that one. Ascospores, you don't have to know that one. Basidiospores.